Good morning. I'm Trevor. I am the associate pastor here. On my last name, which is Backoffner, if you didn't know how to say that, now you do. On my Backoffner side, I come from a long line of church folk. While I am the first of my name to serve as a pastor, 3 generations preceding me have all served in churches. My dad, Rick, he served as an elder at the church I worked at prior to being here, First Christian Church, The Dalles, Oregon. My grandfather, Merv, short for Mervin, was the chairman of the board at Hinson Memorial Baptist Church in Portland, Oregon. They since dropped the memorial. They're just Hinson Baptist now. And his father, Gus, short for Gustav, a Swiss immigrant who came here right before World War I, served as an elder at that same church as his son did. And one of the things that I've had passed down to me because of this line of work in which I find myself is my great-grandfather, Gus, his Bible study books and commentaries. This is one I have here. This is one for his sermon writing materials. It was a book gifted to him by his 3 children on his birthday in 1948. This is McCartney's illustrations. And others, whenever I'm reading a particular text, whenever I'm studying for a sermon or a devotional of some sort, while there's been more recent scholarship that maybe is more helpful with a sermon, I will often grab a commentary or a book like this if I have one and read about that topic or verse that I'm writing on. And in an interesting sort of way, it makes me feel close to my grandfather. He passed away just before I turned 10, and my great-grandfather, who I never had the pleasure of meeting, and it feels like I'm studying the text with them because I'm using the books that they did. I'm reading the same Bible texts they did, and sometimes I'm even getting to read the notes that they put in these books that they wrote in the tiniest handwriting in the margins. I tell you all this because in this book today is an illustration that I've probably read before. I'm going to read to you as it really sets up the topic for our sermon and our text today. From page 237. It says, "A man once came to visit Robert Hall, a famous English preacher, to take some exception to a statement the preacher had made in his sermon. Hall saw that the man was in the bondage of love of money. Having sized the man up, Hall took half a sovereign out of his pocket and, opening the Bible, pointed to the word God. 'Can you see that word?' he said to the man. 'Certainly I can see it.' Then Hall laid the half sovereign over the word. 'Can you see it now?' he asked. There was no need for the man to answer. It was an unforgettable sermon. Money, the love of it, can hide from the soul of man even the face of God." What our text talks about today is greed. It hasn't always been used to talk about greed, but what I see presented in this text warns us about what greed does and how it is antithetical to the way of Jesus. Our story begins with a parable that Jesus tells because of a challenging question. Not that it was challenging and that it was hard for Jesus to answer, because it's not, but in that the person wanted to challenge Jesus. It's the type of question that we try to throw at God and get him to say yes to. I think sometimes we think that because Jesus says he's for us, Jesus is for everything that we want. But that's not true. It's not right. So when we think about this idea of greed, I want you to know that a shepherd isn't concerned with it. We learned something of this last week when James talked about the shepherd leaving the 99 to find the one. If the shepherd were truly greedy, he would have stayed with the 99 and made sure that no more would go missing. But, as James said last week, the shepherd pursues. In light of our text on greed this morning, which I find to be an awesome doozy of a sermon that I chose to preach the same day as the annual society meeting, I want you to hear and remember that a shepherd gives. Let's start by reading from our text, Luke 12, verses 13 through 15. There will be up on the screen. Then someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator between you two?" Then he said to them, "Watch out and guard yourself from all types of greed, because one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." When you hear these words, what do you think might be wrong with the question? Shout them out if you have something come to your mind. Perhaps the issue is that the inheritance wasn't to be divided. Perhaps the issue is that it wasn't the custom. Maybe he just wants Jesus to side with him. And what is Jesus' response? Well, firstly, yes. He says, "Who said I was your arbitrator? Who appointed me to do this?" Now, this was common for a rabbi to do, but it was through a specific court system. For them to go this route is, in some sense, with an air of desperation, which I think Jesus probably recognizes and uses as a teachable moment. First, to say that his dominant thought in the parable is that he shares in verse 15, "Watch out. Guard yourself from greed, because life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Ecclesiastes 5 speaks about this in certain terms. It says, "Here is a misfortune on earth that I have seen. Wealth hoarded by its owner to his own misery. Then that wealth was lost through bad luck. Although he fathered a son, he has nothing left to give him. Just as he came forth from his mother's womb, naked will he return as he came, and he will take nothing in his hand that he may carry away from his toil." We don't get to take all our toys with us. That's something my parents said to me growing up. We don't have a Batman utility belt when we come into this world, and not when we leave either. The only thing that we seem to need in either of these situations is people. But more on that later. Let's read our parable that Jesus shares here, verses 16 through 21. He then told them a parable. "The land of a certain rich man produced an abundant crop. So he thought to himself, 'What should I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops?' Then he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of goods stored up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, celebrate.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded back from you, but who will get what you have prepared for yourself? So it is with the one who stores up riches for himself, but is not rich towards God.'" When Jesus tells us a parable, this type of story, the purpose is to provoke our imagination. It's to provoke our imagination to view God's purposes from a new perspective. That's the definition I found from the organization, the Bible Project. And this also matters in a psychological sense as well. Research shows that people... Whoa. I'm just going to hold that from now on. Research shows that people retain information by linking it to emotions and experiences, which is why stories are so memorable and impactful for us. They awake our emotions around a given teaching, and they help us understand and connect it to our lives. The story of the rich landowner here shows us how greed talks to us. But it's one that's a little subtle. If we take this story at face value, it feels highly practical. If you have too much for the barns or the grain bins, perhaps that you currently hold, why not build bigger grain bins? But often the thing behind these stories are the cultural thoughts that we don't know, the cultural customs. How big were the grain bins to begin with? How many grain bins did he already possess? Let's put this into a little perspective. A wealthy person, a landowner in that part of the world during the time of Jesus, could have possessed a size of grain bin that we would refer to as a granary. granary, which is of a much bigger size than normally a normal person might have. In some archaeological digs, they have come across some that are 3 by 3 meters. That's how big they were. And a 3 by 3 meter granary on the top end could hold 10 metric tons of wheat or barley. And during that time, for someone living in Roman-occupied Palestine, grains like wheat and barley amounted to 50 to 75% of a person's total caloric intake. Now let's assume a few things here. Firstly, the text lists that the rich landowner has multiple barns, and I'm going to approach this conservatively and assume that he has 2. I can't assume that he has more than that because the text doesn't say. I just know he has more than 1. If they're all full and he needs to build bigger ones, he has in his possession 20 metric tons of grain. Yeah, it's a lot. If we make another assumption, is that because of his wealth, he had a larger family and some servants, he could provide for a household of 10 people, including himself. Now, based off all of these numbers and the consumption rate of the time, he would not need to farm more grain for 10 years. He had a store of 10 years between these 2 granaries. And for this time, more so than dollars and cents, produce was wealth. For this rich landowner, his crops are his money. He has more than he knows what to do with, and certainly more than he would need. And there's something to be said for life-changing money and more money than we know what to do with. Let me put in more modern terms. Who here knows who Warren Buffett is? I figured so. At one time, he was the richest man in the world. I think that title goes to Elon Musk now, but Warren Buffett still holds the title for the most liquid assets in his possession. I looked it up, and between personal and business cash reserves, Warren Buffett is sitting on a pile of money amounting to somewhere in the neighborhood of $344 billion. Billion with a B. Now imagine with me, if you will, that Warren Buffett took this $344 billion and he sat it in a big pile in a room. And once it's placed in the room, nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken away, it can't be invested. He's capped at $344 billion. If he were to conservatively spend $1 million a day, how long do you think it would take him to exhaust that pile to $0? Some of you are trying to do the quick math in your head. It's about 940 years. Now, $1 million for most is life-changing money. If I were given a generous allotment of $1 million for needs only, I would be debt-free. I'd pay off my house. I could maybe purchase another car for convenience, set up trusts for my kids, maybe a health savings account for Edie and I for the future. But there aren't many other things I would need beyond that $1 million. I certainly don't foresee any needs beyond that number in the way that I live now. I want to pause here and say this. Money itself is a neutral thing. It is not bad. You are not a bad person if you have a lot of money. But Scripture tells us the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Weaponizing our wealth to the point of stepping into an attitude of greed is wrong. And you can't attain a level of wealth amounting to $344 billion without crossing ethical boundaries. Usually for folks that are in the billions with a B category, their unsavory practices fall under 3 areas. There can be more, but these ones are the most prevalent. The first of these is the exploitation of their employees or their workers. A really good example of this is Amazon under the leadership of Jeff Bezos. Back in the 2010s, Amazon got in trouble for underpaying their workers to the point that many of them were on public assistance. And when a group of employees sued Amazon over this, they received raises. But those raises were only paid for by offsetting other employee benefits. Another area in which this happens is they create huge wealth gaps. Bezos is another great example here. He was incredibly wealthy and then tragedy struck because he went through a divorce prior to the pandemic, and half of his net worth went to his now ex-wife. Then the pandemic hit, and everyone was trapped inside, and everyone had needs, and he became even more wealthy than he was before his divorce. And when he attained that level of wealth, he said that the only thing that made sense for him to do with his excess was to use it to go to outer space. Not raise the wages of his employees, which on average is about $22 an hour, which is not enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any state in our union. Not care for his community, but to go to outer space. Even Amazon as a company has assisted in wealth gaps. They fought against tax bills that would fund resources for the houseless community in Bellevue, Washington. They fought a bill that would require sales tax on any purchases outside Washington state, even though they routinely don't pay federal income taxes as an organization. Third area of crossing ethical boundaries is harming the environment. A 2019 study, which is some time ago, found that the top 1% of earners, if you can call them that, in the world were responsible for more yearly carbon emissions than 66% of humanity. One billionaire, Larry Ellison, was stated to have a carbon footprint 530 times the average American. One guy. Now, to put this in some other numbers, the average car in America emits 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year. That top 1% in how they harm the environment emit 2.72 million metric tons of CO2 per year. That's equivalent to the output of 592,000 cars or 254,000 houses. These type of emissions threaten ecosystems because it causes extreme weather, which leads to food scarcity and then spread of disease, all to make a few more bucks. When you live with this level of greed for an extended period of time, in terms of mental health, it can become a personality trait, a part of who you are. Greed as a personality trait is defined as such: insatiable hunger for more money, power, and recognition, marked by dissatisfaction, a disregard for others or consequences, and a focus on immediate gain over long-term ethics. These are often linked to negative emotions like depression, anger, and hostility, and underlying neural changes in reward emotion centers. This differs from ambition because of its destructive nature and lack of limits, showing up as excessive risk-taking, entitlement, and a focus on self-gain at others' expense. We can think of a few people from pop culture from over the years. Ebenezer Scrooge from Dickens' A Christmas Carol, King Midas in Greek mythology, Hans Gruber from Die Hard, Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob SquarePants, or Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. I tend to wend my way through a sermon without some sort of linear way of communicating, often to the end that folks, and by folks I mean James, maybe it's more of you, often wonder, where is he going with this? I tell you this to say that even if we don't have billions with a B, we can't live in an economic environment such as the one we have in America without it changing the way we view the church. When our economic system is set up for extreme competition and cutthroat tactics, sometimes those things creep into our churches. Now, take this in mind, that I personally have not experienced this type of greed in this church community. I have worked and attended a handful of churches, and this one is the most generous, more than all the others, and it's not close. This is a warning from the text, so let's understand that for what it is. We can hear something in the church that's a strong statement without it being an active problem in our own life. But Jesus has an answer for this type of attitude, even if it comes to a personality trait. Let's continue in verses 22 through 34 of Luke chapter 12. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for there is more to life than food, and more to the body than clothing. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than the birds? And which of you, by worrying, can add an hour to his life? So if you cannot do such a very little thing as this, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the flowers grow. They do not work or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his glory was clothed like one of these. And if this is how God clothes the wild grass, which is here today and tomorrow is tossed into the fire to heat the oven, how much more will he clothe you, you people of little faith? So do not be overly concerned about what you will eat and what you will drink, and do not worry about such things. For all the nations of the world pursue these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, pursue his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father is well pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide yourselves purses that do not wear out, a treasure in heaven that never decreases, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. When I heard this text growing up, if I can get my notes right, it was usually through the lens of this being directed towards the poor. You know, for poor folks, they shouldn't rely on fill in the blank, because instead they should rely on God. They shouldn't covet or worry about where their next meal or clothes would come from, because they should trust God that he would give them exactly what they need. But practically, this doesn't line up because people don't always get what they need. I mean, if you take Spokane County, for instance, 12.5% of our population is food insecure. If we limit that age range down to 13 to 19-year-olds, that number goes up to 17.4%. That experience food insecurity. That's higher than the state average. 10.6% of our population is below the poverty line, and 27% are considered ALICE households, assets limited, income constrained, employed. Means that 27% are roughly 1 to 2 paychecks away from everything going very, very wrong. And more than this, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 houseless individuals in our county. If a message like this is to the poor, why don't those folks have their needs met? One commentator puts it this way. It says, at this point, it is important to note that Jesus does not say that one should ignore food for the sake of life or clothing for the sake of the body. Such an interpretation is quite common among those of us who have food and clothing in abundance. But those others who seldom have enough food or adequate clothing know that life cannot exist without food, and that a body without adequate clothing will not long survive. This should serve as a warning, lest we interpret this passage in ways that demean the struggle of those who are in real want of food and clothing. If we place this text into its proper context, when Jesus talks to the disciples about the parable he just shared, it's still in his mind that greed is the problem. This is for the folks that have more than they need. This is for those that want more but don't have anywhere they can put it to good use. If we approach this culturally, it's seeing things like the American dream and the mass examples of the pursuit of wealth in media, and if we're not careful, we'll start to believe that the acquisition and possession of wealth establishes our identity, and that is entirely wrong. If we only focus on possession, we'll start to think that the church is a place for us to possess too. If we don't like what our denomination or pastor says about a given topic, we might take our money elsewhere. If we have an attitude of, I give this much money, so I should get a say in what carpet we choose, or what ministries are funded, or what color we paint the building. If we start to think in this way, we straighten our identity as followers of Jesus. That's our definition. We are followers of Jesus. We are little Christs, seeking every day to emulate the example that Jesus set of peace, love, sacrifice, and goodness. When it comes to our wealth, verse 33 tells us exactly how we should approach this in following Jesus. We sell our possessions and we give to the poor. John Wesley said this about the exact topic. He said within himself, "What shall I do? And is not the answer ready? Do good. Do all the good thou canst. Let thy plenty supply thy neighbor's wants, and thou wilt never want something to do. Canst thou find none that need the necessaries of life, that are pinched with cold or hunger, none that have not raiment to put on, or a place where to lay their head, none that are wasted with pining sickness, and none that are languishing in prison?" Even in the patristic literature of the early church, there was a common assertion that when you give to the poor, you lend to God. This was based on Proverbs 19:17, which said that the one who is gracious to the poor lends to the Lord. Even Wesley says in another quote to make all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. What he meant by save was not to save money in a bank or a coffee can somewhere, but that he should not spend much of our money so that we would have more of it to give. If you're sitting out there still wondering where I'm going and about this idea of a shepherd gives, here's my real dominant thought when I consider the heart of a shepherd. A shepherd gives so that we might give to others. Shepherd gives so that we might give to others. And to illustrate this, I'll tell you another story from Jesus from Matthew 19. Someone came up to him and said, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to gain eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." "Which ones?" he asked. Jesus replied, "Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "I have wholeheartedly obeyed all these laws. What do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." But when the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he was very rich. You've probably heard the term, "don't be that guy." Let's not be this fellow who's so attached to his wealth that he won't walk with God. Let's trust that God has already given us everything we need, and that through us, others will have what they need too. Pray with me. God, this can be a hard one to hear when everything around us tells us that cash is king, that money is a gateway to life and prosperity and goodness. But in your word, you are the only one who's good, and you give us everything we need. I pray that the church would always be a place where people are able to experience their needs being met in all areas. In your name, God, amen.